And so we continue with Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. In the middle of the night, and all under the rest of our distresses, one of the men that had been down on purpose to see cried out we had sprung a leak. Another said there was 4 foot of water in the hold. Then all hands were called to pull a pump, and that very word to my heart, as I thought, died within me, and I fell backwards upon the side of my bed where I sat into the cabin. However, the men roused me and told me that I that was able to do nothing before was as well able to pump as another, at which I stirred and went to the pump, and worked very heartily. While this was doing, the master, seeing some light colliers, who, not able to ride out the storm, were obliged to slip and run away to sea, and would come near us, ordered to fire a gun as a signal of distress. I, who knew nothing what that meant, was so surprised that I thought the ship had broke, or some dreadful thing had happened. In a word, I was so surprised that I fell down in a swoon. As this was a time when everybody had his own life to think of, nobody minded me, or what was become of me, but another man stepped up to the pump, and, thrusting me aside with his foot, let me lie, thinking I had been dead, and it was a great while before I came to myself. We worked on, but the water increasing in the hold, it was apparent that the ship would flounder, and though the storm began to abate a little, yet as it was not possible she could swim till we might run into a port, so the master continued firing guns for help, and a light ship, who had rayed it out just ahead of us, ventured a boat out to help us. It was with the utmost hazard the boat came near us, but it was impossible for us to get on board, or for the boat to lie near the ship's side, till at last, the men rowing very heartily, and venturing their lives to save ours, our men cast them a rope over the stern with a buoy to it, and then veered it out at great length, which they, after great labour and hazard, took hold of, and we hauled them close under our stern, and got all into their boat. It was to no purpose for them or us, after we were in the boat, to think of reaching to their own ship, so all agreed to let her drive, and only to pull her in towards shore as much as we could, and our master promised them that if the boat was staved upon shore, he would make it good to their master. So, partly rowing and partly driving, our boat went away to the northward, sloping towards the shore almost as far as Winterton Ness. We were not much more than a quarter of an hour out of our ship when we saw her sink, and then I understood for the first time what was meant by a ship foundering in the sea. I must acknowledge I had hardly eyes to look upon when the seamen told me she was sinking, for from that moment they rather put me in the boat than that I might be said to go in. My heart was, as it were, dead within me, partly with fright, partly with horror of mind and thoughts of what was yet before me. While we were in this condition, the men yet labouring at the oar to bring the boat near the shore, we could see, when our boat, mounting the waves, we were able to see the shore, a great many people running along the shore to assist us when we should come near. But we made but slow way towards the shore, nor were we able to reach the shore, till, being past the lighthouse at Winterton, the shore falls off to the westward towards Cromer, and so the land broke off a little, the violence of the wind. Here we got in, and though not without much difficulty, got all safe on shore and walked afterwards on foot to Yarmouth, where, as unfortunate men, we were used with great humanity, as well by the magistrates of the town, who assigned us good quarters, as by particular merchants and owners of ships, and had money given us sufficient to carry us either to London or back to Hull, as we thought fit. Had I now had the sense to gone back to Hull, and have gone home, I had been happy, and my father, an emblem of our blessed Saviour's parable, had even killed the fatted calf for me, for, hearing the ship I went away in castaway in Yarmouth Road, it was a great while before he had any assurance that I was not drowned. But my ill fate pushed me on now, with an obstinacy that nothing could resist, and though I had several times loud calls from my reason and my more composed judgment to go home, yet I had no power to do it. I know not what to call this, nor what will I urge that it is a secret overruling decree that hurries us on to be the instruments of our own destruction, even though it be before us, and that we push upon it with our eyes open. Certainly nothing but some such decreed unavoidable misery attending, and which it was impossible for me to escape, could have pushed me forward against the calm reasoning and persuasions of my most retired thoughts, and against two such visible instructions as I had met with in my first attempt. My comrade, who had helped to harden me before, and who was the master's son, was now less forward than I. The first time he spoke to me after we were at Yarmouth, which was not till 2 or 3 days, for we were separated in the town to several quarters. I say the first time he saw me, it appeared his tone was altered, and looked very melancholy, and shaking his head asked me how I did, and telling his father who I was, and how I had come this voyage only for a trial in order to go farther abroad. His father, turning to me with a very grave and concerned tone, "Young man," he says, "you ought never to go to sea any more. You ought to take this for a plain and visible token that you are not to be a seafaring man." "Why, sir," said I, "will you go to sea no more?" "That is another case," said he. "It is my calling, and therefore my duty. But as you made this voyage for a trial, you see what taste heaven has given you of what you are to expect if you persist. Perhaps this has all befallen us on your account, like Jonah in the ship of Tarshish. Pray," continues he, "what are you, and on what account did you go to sea?" Upon that I told him some of my story, at the end of which he burst out with a strange kind of passion. "What had I done," says he, "that such an unhappy wretch should come into my ship? I would not set foot in the same ship with thee again for £1,000. This indeed was, as I said, an excursion of his spirits, which were yet agitated by the sense of his loss, and was further than he could have authority to go. However, he afterwards talked very gravely to me, exhorted me to go back into my father, and not tempt Providence to my ruin, told me he might see a visible hand of heaven against me, and "Young man," said he, "depend upon it, if you do not go back, wherever you go you will meet with nothing but disasters and disappointments till your father's words are fulfilled upon you." We parted soon after, for I made him a little answer, and I saw him no more. Which way he went I know not. As for me, having some money in my pocket, I travelled to London by land, and there, as well as on the road, had many struggles with myself, what course of life I should take, and whether I should go home or to sea. As to going home, shame opposed the best motions that offered to my thoughts, and it immediately occurred to me how I should be laughed at among the neighbours, and should be ashamed to see not my father and mother only, but even everybody else, from whence I had since often observed how incongruous and irrational the common temper of mankind is, especially of youth, to that reason which ought to guide them in such cases, namely, that they are not ashamed to sin, and yet are ashamed to repent. Not ashamed of the action for which they ought justly be esteemed fools, but are ashamed of the returning, which only can make them to be esteemed wise men. In this state of life, however, I remained some time uncertain what measures to take and what course of life to lead. An irresistible reluctance continued to going home, and as I stayed a while, the remembrance of the distress I had been in wore off, and as that abated, the little notion I had in my desires to a return wore off with it, till at last I quite laid aside the thoughts of it, and looked out for a voyage. That evil influence which carried me first away from my father's house, that hurried me into the wild, an ingested notion of raising my fortune, and that impressed those conceits so forcibly upon me as to make me deaf to all good advice, and to the entreaties and even command of my father, I say, the same influence, whatever it was, presented the most unfortunate of all enterprises to my view, and I went on board a vessel bound to the coast of Africa, or as our sailors vulgarly call it, a voyage to Guinea. It was my great misfortune that in all these adventures I did not ship myself as a sailor, whereby, though I might indeed have worked a little harder than ordinary, yet at the same time I had learned the duty of an office of a foremast man, and in time might have qualified myself for a mate or lieutenant, if not for a master. But as it was my fate, always my fate, to choose for the worst, so I did here, for, having money in my pocket and good clothes upon my back, I would always go on board in the habit of a gentleman, and so I neither had any business in the ship or learned to do any. It was my lot first of all to fall into pretty good company in London, which has not always happened to such loose and unguided young fellows as I then was, the devil generally not omitting to lay some snare for them very early. But it was not so with me. I first fell acquainted with the master of a ship who had been on the coast of Guinea, and who, having laid very good success there, was resolved to go again, and who, taking a fancy to my conversation, which was not at all disagreeable at that time, hearing me say I had a mind to see the world, told me if I would go the voyage with him I should be at no expense. I should be his messmate and his companion, and if I could carry anything with me, I should have all the advantage of it that the trade would admit, and perhaps I might meet with some encouragement. I embraced the offer, and entering into a strict friendship with this captain, who was an honest and plain-dealing man, I went the voyage with him, and carried a small adventure with me, which, by the disinterested honesty of my friend the captain, I increased very considerably, for I carried about £40 in such toys and trifles as the captain directed me to buy. This £40 I had mustered together by the assistance of some of my relations whom I corresponded with, and who, I believe, got my father, or at least my mother, to contribute so much as that to my first adventure. This was the only voyage which I may say was successful in all my adventures, and which I owe the integrity and honesty of my friend and the captain, under whom I also got a competent knowledge of the mathematics and the rules of navigation, learned how to keep an account of the ship's course, take an observation, and, in short, to understand some things that were needful to be understood by a sailor, for as he took delight to introduce me, I took delight to learn, and, in a word, this voyage made me both a sailor and a merchant, for I brought home £5 9 ounces of gold dust for my adventure, which yielded me in London, at my return, almost £300, and this filled me with those aspiring thoughts which have since so completed my ruin. Yet even in this voyage I had my misfortunes too, particularly that I was continually sick, being thrown into a violent calenture by the excessive heat of the climate, our principal trading being upon the coast, from the latitude of 15 degrees north even to the line itself. I was now set up for a Guinea trader, and my friend, to my great misfortune, dying soon after his arrival, I resolved to go the same voyage again, and I embarked in the same vessel with one who was his mate in the former voyage, and had now got the command of the ship. This was the unhappiest voyage that ever man made. For though I did not carry quite £100 of my new gained wealth, so that I had 200 left, and which I lodged with my friend's widow, who was very just to me, yet I fell into terrible misfortunes in this voyage, and the first was this, namely, our ship making her course towards the Canary Islands, or rather between those islands and the African shore, was surprised in the grey of the morning by a Turkish rover of Sallee, who gave chase to us with all the sail she could make. We crowded also as much our canvas as our yards would spread, or our masts carry, to have got clear. But finding the pirate gained upon us, and would certainly come up with us in the next few hours, he prepared to fight, our ship having 12 guns and the rogue 18. About 3 in the afternoon he came up with us, and bringing to, by mistake, just athwart our quarter, instead of athwart our stern, as he intended, we brought 8 of our guns to bear on that side, and poured in a broadside upon him, which made him steer off again, after returning our fire and pouring into his small shot from near 200 men which he had on board. However, we had not a man touched, all our men keeping close. He prepared to attack us again, and we to defend ourselves. But laying us on board the next time upon our other quarter, he entered 60 men upon our decks, who immediately fell to cutting and hacking the decks and rigging. We plied them with small shot, half-pikes, powder chests, and such like, and cleared our deck of them twice. However, to cut short this melancholy part of the story, our ship being disabled, and 3 of our men killed and 8 wounded, we were obliged to yield, and were carried all prisoners into Sallee, a port belonging to the Moors. The usage I had there was not so dreadful as first apprehended, nor was I carried up the country by the Emperor's court, as the rest of our men were, but was kept by the captain of the rover as his proper prize, and made his slave, being young and nimble and fit for business. At this surprising change of my circumstances, from a merchant to a miserable slave, and I was perfectly overwhelmed, and now I looked back upon my father's prophetic discourse to me, that I should be miserable, and have none to relieve me, which I thought was now so effectually brought to pass, that it could not be any worse. And now the hand of heaven had overtaken me, and I was undone without redemption. But alas, this was but a taste of the misery I was to go through, as will appear in the sequel of this story. As my new patron or master had taken me home to his house, I was in hopes that he would take me with him when he went to sea again, believing that it would some time or other be his fate to be taken by a Spanish or Portugal man of war, and that I should be set at liberty. But this hope of mine was soon taken away, for when he went to sea he left me on shore to look after his little garden and do the common drudgery of slaves about his house. And when he came home again from his cruise, he ordered me to lie in the cabin to look after the ship. Here I meditated nothing but my escape, and what method I might take effect in, but what no way found that he had least probability in it. Nothing presented to make the supposition of it rational, for I had nobody to communicate it to that would embark with me, no fellow slave, no Englishman, Irishman or Scotsman there but myself, so that for 2 years, though I often pleased myself with the imagination, yet I had never had the least encouraging prospect of putting it in practice. After about 2 years an odd circumstance presented itself, which put the old thought of making some attempt for my liberty again in my head. My patron lying at home longer than usual without fitting out his ship, which, as I had heard, was for want of money. He used constantly once or twice a week, sometimes oftener if the weather was fair, to take the ship's pinnace and go out into the road a fishing, as he always took me and a young Moresco with him to row the boat. We made him very merry, and I proved very dexterous in catching fish, insomuch that sometimes he would send me with a Moor, one of his kinsmen, and the youth, the Moresco as they called him, to catch a dish of fish for him. It happened one time that going a-fishing in the stark, calm morning, a fog rose so thick that though we were not half a league from the shore, that we lost sight of it, and rowing we knew not whither or which way, we laboured all day and all the next night, and when the morning came we found we had pulled off to sea instead of pulling in for the shore, and that we were at least 2 leagues from the shore. However, we got well in again, though with a great deal of labour and some danger, for the wind began to blow pretty fresh in the morning, but particularly we were all very hungry. But our patron, warned by this disaster, resolved to take more care of himself for the future, and having lying by him the long boat of our English ship he had taken, he resolved he would not go a-fishing any more without a compass and some provision. So he ordered the carpenter of his ship, who also was an English slave, to build a little stateroom or cabin in the middle of the longboat, like that of a barge, with a place to stand behind it to steer and hail home the main sheet, and room before a hand or two to stand and work the sails. She sailed with what we call a shoulder of mutton sail, and the boom gibed over the top of the cabin, which lay very snug and low, and had in it room for him to lie with a slave or two, and a table to eat on, with some small lockers to put in some bottles of such liquor as he thought fit to drink, particularly his bread, rice, and coffee. We went frequently out on this boat a-fishing, and as I was most dexterous to catch fish for him, he never went without me. It happened that he had appointed to go out in his boat, either for pleasure or for fish, with 2 or 3 Moors of some distinction in that place, and for whom he had provided extraordinarily, and had therefore sent on board the boat overnight a larger store of provisions than ordinary, and had ordered me to get ready 3 fusees with powder and shot, which were on board his ship, for that they designed some sport of fowling as well as fishing. I got all things ready as he had directed, and waited the next morning with the boat washed clean, and her ancient pendants out, and everything to accommodate his guests. when by and by my patron came on board alone and told me his guests had put off going upon some business that fell out, and ordered me with the man and boy as usual, to go out with the boat and catch them some fish, for that his friends would sup at his house, and commanded that as soon as I had got some fish I should bring it home to his house, all which I was prepared to do. This moment my former notions of deliverance darted into my thoughts, for now I found I was like to have a little ship at my command, and my master being gone, I prepared to furnish myself, not for a fishing business, but for a voyage, though I knew not, neither did I so much as consider whither I should steer, for anywhere to get out of that place was my way. My first contrivance was to make a pretence to speak to this Moor, to get something for our subsistence on board, for I told him that we must not presume to eat of our patron's bread. He said this was true, so he brought a large basket of rusk or biscuit of their kind, and 3 jars with fresh water into the boat. I knew where my patron's case of bottles stood, which it was evident by the make we were taken out of some English prize, and I conveyed them into the boat while the Moor was on shore. And if they had been there before our master, I conveyed also a great lump of beeswax into the boat, which weighed above 1/2 weight, with a parcel of twine or thread, a hatchet, a saw, and a hammer, all which were of great use to us afterwards, especially the wax to make candles. Another trick I tried upon him, which he innocently came into also. His name was Ishmael, who they called Mully or Moly, so I called him Moly. Said I, "Our patron's guns are on board the boat. Can you not get a little powder and shot? It may well we kill some alchemist, a fowl like our curlews, for ourselves, for I know he keeps the gunner's stores in the ship." "Yes," said he, "I'll bring some." And accordingly he brought a great leather pouch, which held about 1.5 pounds of powder, or rather more, and another with shot, that had 5 or 6 pounds, with some bullets, and put all our into the boat. At the same time, I had found some powder of my master's in the great cabin, with which I was filled with one of the large bottles in the case, which was almost empty, pouring what was in it into another, and thus furnished with everything needful, we sailed out of the port to fish. The castle, which is at the entrance of the port, knew who we were, and took no notice of us, and we were not above a mile out of the port before we hauled in our sail, and set us down to fish. The wind blew from the north-northeast, which was contrary to my desire, for I had it blown southerly. I had been sure to have made the coast of Spain, and at least reached the Bay of Cadiz, but my resolutions were, blow which way it would, I would be gone from that horrid place where I was, and leave the rest to fate. After we had fished some time, and catching nothing, for when I had a fish on my hook I would not pull them up, that he might not see them, I said to the Moor, "This will not do, our master will not be thus served, we must stand farther off." He, thinking no harm, agreed, and being in the head of the boat, set the sails, and as I had the helm, I run the boat out near a league farther, and then brought her to, as if I would fish, when, giving the boy to the helm, I stepped forward to where the Moor was, and making as if I stooped for something behind him, I took him by surprise with my arm under his legs, and tossed him clear overboard into the sea. He rose immediately, for he swam like a cork, and called to me, begged to be taken in, told me he will go all over the world with me. He swam so strong after the boat that he would have reached me very quickly, there being but little wind. Upon which I stepped into the cabin, and fetching one of the fowling pieces, I presented it at him, and told him I had done him no hurt, and if he would be quiet, I would do him none. "But," said I, "you swim well enough to reach the shore, and the sea is calm. Make the best of your way to shore, and I will do you no harm. But if you come near the boat, I'll shoot you through the head, for I am resolved to have my liberty." So he turned himself about and swam for the shore, and I make no doubt but he reached it with ease, for he was an excellent swimmer. I could have been content to have taken this Moor with me, and have drowned the boy, but there was no venturing to trust him. When he was gone, I turned to the boy who they called Jory, and said to him, "Jory, if you will be faithful to me, I'll make you a great man. But if you will not stroke your face to be true to me, that is, swear by Mahomet and his father's beard, I must throw you into the sea too." The boy smiled in my face and spoke so innocently that I could not mistrust him, and swore to be faithful to me and go all over the world with me. While I was in view of the Moor that was swimming, I stood out directly to sea with the boat, rather stretching it to windward, that they might think me gone towards the strait's mouth, as indeed anyone who had been in their wits must have been supposed to do, for who would have truly supposed we were sailed on to the southward, to the truly barbarian coast, where whole nations of natives were sure to surround us with their canoes and destroy us, where we could never go once to the shore but we should be devoured by savage beasts, or the more merciless savages of humankind. But as soon as it grew dusk in the evening, I changed my course and steered directly south and by east, bending my course a little toward the east, that I might keep in with the shore, and having a fair fresh gale of wind and a smooth quiet sea, I made such sail that I believe by the next day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when I first made the land, I could not be less than 150 miles south of Salé, quite behind the Emperor of Morocco's dominions, or indeed of any other kind thereabouts, for we saw no people. Yet such was the fright I had taken at the Moors, and the dreadful apprehensions I had of falling into their hands, that I would not stop, or go on shore, or come to an anchor, the wind continuing fair, till I had sailed in that manner 5 days, and the wind shifting to the southward. I concluded also that if any of our vessels were in chase of me, they would also now give over. So I ventured to make the coast, and came to an anchor in the mouth of a little river. I knew not what or where, neither what latitude nor country, what nation or what river. I neither saw nor desired to see any people. The principal thing I wanted was fresh water. We came into this creek in the evening, resolving to swim on shore as soon as it was dark, and discover the country. But as soon as it was dark, we heard such dreadful noises of the barking, roaring, and howling of wild creatures, of we knew not what kinds, that the poor boy was ready to die with fear, and begged me not to go on the shore till day. "Well, Zorry," said I, "then I won't. But it may be that we see these men by day, who will be as bad as us as those lions." "Then we give them the shoot gun," said Jory, laughing, making them run away. Such English Jory spoke by conversing among us slaves. However, I was glad to see the boy so cheerful, and I gave him a dram out of our patron's case of bottles to cheer him up. After all, Zorry's advice was good, and I took it. We dropped our little anchor and lay still all night. I say still, for we slept none, for in 2 or 3 days we saw vast great creatures, we knew not what to call them, of many sorts, come down to the seashore and run into the water, wallowing and washing themselves for the pleasure of cooling themselves, and they made such hideous howlings and yellings that I never indeed heard the like. And that's all for today's entry of Robinson Crusoe.